She walked into that reunion with her head high and her armor on. What she didn't know was that somewhere across the city, a man who'd spent 8 months hunting for her across 3 continents had just landed at Hartsfield-Jackson. He wasn't here for the reunion. He didn't know anyone in that ballroom. He came for one woman. The same woman standing alone under crystal chandeliers right now, being picked apart by people who never deserved to be in the same room as her. Tonight, everything changes. If you're watching this, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Follow me all the way to the end. Because this story, it's going to go somewhere you don't expect. The dress had cost Zuri Holloway $412. She knew the exact number because she'd stood in the dressing room at Phipps Plaza for 22 minutes arguing with herself about it, turning in front of the mirror at angles that were almost cruel in their honesty, asking whether the deep burgundy against her dark skin was striking or whether she was just telling herself that because she needed to believe it. The saleswoman had been careful not to seem too eager. The kind of careful that meant she'd read the situation and understood that this particular customer didn't want to be sold anything. She wanted to be seen. Zuri had bought the dress. She'd hung it in her closet for 6 days without touching it, which was how she knew the reunion was already inside her head in a way she hadn't allowed herself to admit. She ran a successful architecture firm. She had 12 employees, 3 ongoing commercial projects, and a reputation in Atlanta's design community that she'd built entirely on her own. She'd survived a recession, a partnership that fell apart in the ugliest way possible, and 2 years of working out of a converted garage on Edgewood Avenue before she could afford actual office space. She did not need the approval of people she hadn't spoken to in a decade. And yet, the dress. She told herself it was professional vanity. You showed up to these things looking like you'd won because otherwise people would spend the entire evening deciding you'd lost. And then you'd spend the next several months hearing about it secondhand through mutual connections who didn't realize they were being unkind when they passed along what so-and-so had said about how Zuri seemed tired, seemed stressed, seemed like maybe the firm wasn't doing as well as she'd been telling people. Atlanta was enormous, and also, somehow, microscopic. People talked. The circles overlapped in ways that still surprised her after 11 years in the city. So the dress was armor. That was what she told herself on the drive over. Radio low, city lights sliding past the windows of her Volvo, the spring air warm enough that she'd crack the window an inch and could smell the blooming Bradford pears that lined Peachtree Street every April like some fragrant suburban apology for how much the city had changed. The hotel was on Buckhead. Of course it was. The Whitmore Grand because someone on the reunion planning committee, she suspected Marcus Delaney, who had gone into finance and never once let anyone forget it, had decided that the 10-year reunion of the Whitmore University class of 2014 deserved something appropriately symbolic. And what was more symbolic than hosting it at a hotel that shared the school's name and cost $400 a night? She handed her keys to the valet without looking at him, which was not something she was proud of. And she stood for a moment on the marble steps outside the entrance, looking through the tall glass doors at the warm spill of light from the chandeliers inside, watching the shapes of people moving in there. And she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she'd been feeling since she'd RSVP'd yes 3 weeks ago against every instinct she possessed. She went in. The ballroom was already half full, tables arranged with the kind of careful, casual elegance that meant someone had spent significant money on a party planner. Pale orchids in low glass vases, votives everywhere, the kind of soft string light arrangement that made everyone look like they were being photographed for something aspirational. A DJ was playing something low and unmemorable in the corner. There was an open bar on the far wall with a queue of people who had clearly decided that this evening required chemical assistance, and Zuri understood them completely. She found a glass of champagne at the first passing tray, and took it more out of something to do with her hands than any genuine desire for it. And she stood near one of the floral arrangements and let her eyes move across the room doing the inventory she'd promised herself she wouldn't do, looking for the faces she knew, cataloging what 10 years had done to them. Marcus Delaney, who was exactly as pleased with himself as she'd anticipated, standing near the bar in a suit that fit poorly across the shoulders. Candace Whitfield, who had been 2 years ahead of them and had somehow attached herself to the reunion circuit anyway, talking loudly to a group near the entrance. Derek Okonkwo, who had been genuinely kind to her in college and who she'd lost touch with and felt a small warm pulse of something uncomplicated when she spotted him across the room. And then Victoria Ashcroft. Zuri saw her before Victoria saw her, which was the only advantage she'd have for the rest of the evening. Victoria was standing at a table near the center of the room with three other women, all of them impeccably dressed, all of them wearing the particular expression of people who were performing enjoyment rather than experiencing it. In college, Victoria had been the kind of beautiful that was also somehow a threat, not to anyone's safety, but to anyone who needed to believe the world was fair. She came from money that was old enough to be quiet about itself, which was somehow more intimidating than the new kind. She'd been in the same architecture school cohort as Zuri, which had always struck Zuri as an odd choice for someone who seemed designed by the universe to marry well and summer somewhere European. But Victoria had been talented, genuinely talented, which had made disliking her more complicated than it should have been. They'd never been friends, something closer to the opposite. Now Victoria looked up, and their eyes met across the room, and Victoria's expression did the thing it had always done. A micro-calculation, almost invisible, the briefest flicker of assessment before the social performance snapped back into place, and she smiled with her mouth, but not the rest of her face, and turned back to the women at her table. Zuri drank her champagne. She spent the next 40 minutes doing what she'd told herself she was going to do, which was talk to the people she'd actually liked, catch up with Derek, who had gone into sustainable urban design and was working on a project in West Africa that he was genuinely animated about, and she felt herself relax slightly, felt the tight thing in her chest loosen a fraction. She talked to two women she'd been friendly with but never close to, exchanged cards with a man who worked in city planning, and expressed actual interest in some of her firm's commercial work. And she thought, okay, this is fine. You can do this. You're fine. She was not paying attention to Victoria's table. She should have been paying attention to Victoria's table. She was coming back from the bar. Water this time. She'd switched to water because the champagne had been doing something complicated to her emotional state that she didn't trust. When she passed close enough to Victoria's table to hear, without intending to, the particular low-register murmur of a conversation that had been calibrated to carry. Always had that energy, even in school. Like she was daring you to say something. Is she married? God, no. A pause. A small sound that Zuri classified with cold precision as a laugh. No one could deal with that for long. She's completely closed off. Always has been. It's exhausting just being around it. She does look good, though. This voice was the most neutral one, someone Zuri didn't recognize. She looks like she works. Victoria's voice, unmistakable. That particular flat elegance she used when she was being unkind and wanted it to read as observation. There's a difference between looking good and looking like everything you have, you earned with your teeth. Men find that frightening. I don't mean it as an insult. I just think some women don't understand that being that relentless has costs. Zuri kept walking. She walked at a perfectly measured pace, which required more physical effort than she would have liked to admit, because her body wanted to stop, to turn, to do something with the cold, specific anger that had moved through her like weather. Her face was still. She'd learned that a long time ago, not to let things show. It had been described to her more than once, and by people who thought they were helping, as a wall, as off-putting, as intimidating. She'd spent years rewriting those comments in her own head, as proof that she was composed, professional, controlled. Standing now near a floral arrangement she wasn't seeing, she thought about what composed felt like from the inside, and the answer was, like swallowing something jagged. She'd been here 70 minutes. She needed to stay another 90, minimum, to avoid the particular social calculus of leaving early, which was its own kind of admission. She needed to eat something because she hadn't eaten since 2 in the afternoon. She needed to stop thinking about Victoria Ashcroft's voice. She was constructing a plan for the remaining 90 minutes when she heard a shift in the room. Not a sound, exactly. Or not only a sound, more like a change in pressure. The specific alteration in ambient noise that happens when a significant number of people redirect their attention in the same direction at the same time. Zuri had felt it in presentations, in site walkthroughs, in the moment during a design reveal when a client's body language changed and you understood that something had landed. She turned toward the door because the room had turned toward the door. A man had come in. She registered him in pieces, the way you register a car accident. Not all at once, but in separate details that the brain assembles afterward. He was Korean, tall by any standard, wearing a dark suit that had been made for him by someone who understood architecture the way Zuri understood it. Form serving, function serving, presence. No tie. No adornment. He didn't need it. He moved through the entrance the way certain people moved through spaces, with a calm that was not relaxed but deliberate, like every step was a decision he'd already made and was simply executing. Two men flanked him at a distance that looked casual but was not, and she was close enough to one of them as they passed to see the brief practice scan he performed of the room's corners, the exits, the groupings of people. The room had noticed. Victoria's table had noticed. She could see Victoria from this angle, see the repositioning that happened without apparent effort, the way Victoria's chin came up slightly, the way she murmured something to the woman beside her and touched her hair once, quickly, in that specific gesture women made when they were aware of being looked at and wanted to manage it. The man was not looking at Victoria. He was not looking at anyone in the way a person looks when they're surveying a room. He was looking with the specificity of someone who was looking for something particular, and Zuri watched this with detached curiosity because it was slightly strange, the particular intensity of it, the way his eyes moved through the room with something clinical underneath the stillness, and she thought, he's searching for someone. She looked around, trying to identify who he might be looking for. It took her an embarrassingly long moment to understand that the reason she couldn't identify who he was looking for was because his eyes had stopped. On her. He was looking at her. And then he was walking toward her. Zuri Holloway had, in the course of running her own business and navigating the specific social architecture of Atlanta's professional class, developed a fairly reliable sense of the dynamics of any room she entered. She understood power when she saw it. She understood the difference between wealth and influence, between status and authority, between a man who commanded attention because he was handsome and a man who commanded attention because the room understood, on some primal level, that something serious was walking through it. She had never seen this particular man before in her life. He stopped directly in front of her. He was close enough that she had to adjust her chin slightly to maintain eye contact, which she did because she was not about to break eye contact, and she was aware of the perfume of his presence, something clean, restrained, like dark wood and cold air. And she was aware of the absolute perfect silence that had descended on the nearest 15 feet of this very noisy room, and she was aware of her own heartbeat doing something embarrassing inside her chest. He looked at her the way people looked at something they'd been searching for across a very long distance. Then he placed one hand, with a gentleness that was somehow more disorienting than anything else had been, against the small of her back, and he said, low enough that it was almost private, "Baby, there you are." The champagne glass in Zuri's hand was going to shatter if she tightened her grip any further. She did not tighten her grip. She said, keeping her voice exactly level, "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" His expression did not change. It was a face built for not changing. Strong jaw, dark eyes that were doing something she couldn't categorize, something that sat in the territory between gravity and warmth. He did not look like a man who was confused or who had mistaken her for someone else. He looked like a man who was doing something deliberate. "Yes," he said, "but I'll explain it to you." "That's not how this works," she said. "You don't get to walk up to someone you don't know and put your hand on them and then ask for time to explain." "You're right." He withdrew his hand with an ease that surprised her, stepping back half a step, not retreating, just creating the space she'd asked for without her asking for it verbally. "I apologize. May I sit with you instead?" It wasn't quite a question. "Why?" she said. "Because we've met before," he said, "and I've been looking for you for a long time, and I'd rather not have this conversation with an audience, but if this is where we do it, I can do that." Zuri was very aware, in the specific way she was always aware of rooms, that approximately 40 people were watching this exchange. She was aware of Victoria's table in her peripheral vision, of the particular stillness over there that meant rapt attention. She was aware that her heart was still doing the embarrassing thing, and that the man standing in front of her had just said, "I've been looking for you for a long time." Like it was a simple fact rather than the most unnerving sentence anyone had said to her in recent memory. "I don't know you," she said. "Seoul," he said. "Last October, a Tuesday. You were outside a pharmacy near Insadong, and it was raining." The room around her continued to exist. The string lights continued to glow. The DJ continued to play something forgettable. Zuri Holloway stood very still and felt the bottom of something drop out from under her, because she remembered Seoul. She remembered the rain. She remembered the man, Ochas. She hadn't thought about it in months, had cataloged it in the mental file she kept for the small, inexplicable moments that make up a life. The kind of memory with no narrative payoff, no before and after, just a fragment that sits there glowing slightly in the dark of the mind for reasons that resist explanation. She'd been in Seoul for 6 days, working with a South Korean urban development consultancy that had reached out after seeing a presentation she'd given at an AIA conference in Chicago. The trip had been professional, structured, exhausting in the good way. Long days in boardrooms and site visits and evenings spent alone in her hotel room with takeout, and the particular luxury of not having to be anyone specific. The pharmacy had been on the walk back from a dinner that had ended early, a business dinner that had proceeded with technical efficiency and cultural formality and very little actual connection, and she'd stopped because she'd had the beginning of a headache and wanted something for it, and she'd been standing outside waiting for a rideshare in the rain, which had started too suddenly for her to have done anything about it, except stand closer to the wall and decide it wasn't worth the indignity of running. The man had been there already, sitting on the step to the side of the pharmacy entrance, under the slight overhang of the awning. Not enough shelter for two people, but enough for one if you didn't mind the edge of the rain. He was wearing a dark coat and looking at the ground with the specific vacancy of a person who was not seeing the ground, but was somewhere else entirely. He had a small bag from the pharmacy in his hand. He looked, Zuri had thought at the time, like the inside of a very quiet catastrophe. She'd almost definitely intended to walk past because she was in a foreign city and it was raining and she was tired, and the cultural calculus of whether to address a stranger's visible unhappiness in a context where you were already a stranger yourself was genuinely complicated. But she'd stopped, and in the way that she would later be unable to explain to herself, she'd crouched down slightly to meet his eyeline and said, "You okay?" He'd looked up at her. His eyes, she remembered, had been very dark and very tired. "No," he'd said in English, which had surprised her. "Not especially." "Fair enough," she'd said. "I'm going to stand here anyway because my car is 20 minutes out and your awning is the only awning." "It's not my awning." "I know, I'm announcing my presence before I take a piece of it." He'd almost smiled. Not quite. Something that suggested the memory of smiling. She'd taken a position against the wall to his left, and they'd stood there in a quiet that was, against all reasonable expectation, not uncomfortable. Her rideshare had pushed to 35 minutes. She'd had a second umbrella in her bag, the collapsible kind she'd bought at the airport because she'd looked at Seoul's April weather history and made a practical decision, and she'd opened it and held it out without a lot of ceremony and said, "I have a spare if you want it." He'd looked at the umbrella for a long moment like he was deciding something. He'd taken it. They'd talked. Not about anything serious at first. She told him she was in Seoul for work, that she was an architect. He'd asked what kind of building she loved to design most, which was a more interesting question than she usually got from strangers, and she'd said, honestly, the kind that people don't notice holding them together until they're not there anymore. Structures that become invisible because they work so well. He'd been quiet after that. Then he'd said something she'd held on to without knowing why. "I think I've been building things the wrong way." She'd asked his name. He'd said, "June." She'd given him her coffee, the last of it from the cup she'd been carrying since the restaurant, because it was cold and she didn't need it anymore, and he looked like he did, and they'd talked for nearly an hour about things she couldn't now entirely reconstruct. She remembered the shape of the conversation more than the content, the texture of it, the strange ease of two people with no context or obligation to each other existing for an hour in the same space without performance. Her car had come. She'd stood up, and he'd stood with her, and she'd seen him fully for the first time, taller than she'd registered, holding the umbrella like he was still deciding whether he deserved it. "Feel better?" she'd said. "I'll try," he'd said. She'd gotten in the car. She'd looked back once and he was still standing there under the umbrella she'd given him, watching the car until it turned the corner. She'd thought about that for days after, the image of him standing there in the rain, and then the trip had ended and Atlanta had resumed and the image had moved to the back of the mental archive and stayed there, warm and inexplicable and unreachable. She was looking at him now in a hotel ballroom in Atlanta, and the architecture of that rainy October evening was reassembling itself in her chest with a speed and precision that made it difficult to breathe normally. "June," she said. "Seo Jun-tae," he said. "I should have told you my full name." She searched his face for something dishonest and didn't find it, and that was somehow more frightening than if she had. "What are you doing here?" she said. "I came to find you." He said it the way he'd said everything else, without qualification, without the social softening that people use to make true things more digestible. "I've been trying to reach you for months. I had your contact information from... It took me a while to locate you specifically. I called several times. I sent messages. You didn't answer." "I don't answer numbers I don't recognize." Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "I get a lot of unsolicited contact." "I know." Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite frustration. Something that sat between them. I eventually decided to come. You flew to Atlanta. Yes, because I gave you an umbrella. Because you treated me like a person, he said, when I had forgotten what that felt like. The room was very much still watching. Zuri was aware of it in the way you're aware of being on a stage. The particular amplification of your own self-consciousness that comes from knowing other people are reading you. She was also aware that she was shaking slightly, which was unprecedented and unwelcome, and she decided that she needed to sit down before her knees made the decision for her. She gestured toward the nearest empty table. Sit. He sat. She sat across from him and put her hands flat on the table and looked at him with the same expression she used when a contractor gave her a number that was trying to obscure something. Who are you? She said. The real version, not June from the pharmacy step. He held her gaze. That was also the real version. You have men at the door. Yes. This hotel has been on edge since you walked in. I've watched 4 separate people take out their phones since you sat down. You travel with security. Yes. So who are you? He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of reluctance, but the quiet of choosing the accurate words over the easy ones. My name is Seo Juntai. My family runs several businesses. I have interests in hospitality, shipping, logistics, and other areas. He paused. Some of those areas are not the kind that get discussed in annual reports. Zuri had been born in Atlanta and raised by a mother who had worked for 30 years in criminal defense. She understood what not discussed in annual reports meant. She understood it with the specific fluency of someone who had grown up learning to read what people didn't say. How criminal, she said. Significantly, he said. No flinching, no performance. Just the word, dropped clean and unadorned into the space between them. She absorbed this. She said, and you flew to Atlanta to find the woman who gave you an umbrella. And coffee, and an hour of conversation. And the only genuine human interaction I'd had in months. Why were you alone on that step? She said. Why weren't you surrounded by... She gestured slightly toward the 2 men near the entrance who were doing a very convincing impression of people who weren't watching. All of that. Something changed in his face. The briefest tightening, the specific physical signature of a wound that hadn't finished healing. I'd just been told that my closest lieutenant had been working against me for 3 years. Building a case to take my organization from me. Using the access I'd given him, the trust He'd been my closest friend before that, since we were 18. He stopped. My security removed me from the immediate situation. They put me in a car. I asked the driver to pull over, and I went to the pharmacy because I needed something for the headache, and I needed 15 minutes where no one was looking at me like they were calculating what I was worth to them. He said all of it with the same controlled flatness he said everything. Like he was reporting from a distance on something that had happened to another person. She recognized the technique. And then some American woman came and took part of your awning, Zuri said. And then you came, he said. And you asked if I was okay. And you told me about invisible structures. And you gave me your coffee. And you didn't want anything from me. And I hadn't had that in so long that I couldn't find the name for it until you were already gone. The string lights overhead made everything warm. The DJ was playing something. She didn't know what. The room was still watching. Across the ballroom, she could see Victoria at her table, no longer performing enjoyment, just watching with the naked assessment of someone whose map of the world was being redrawn against her will. Zuri Holloway had come here tonight convinced that she was fine, that she didn't need anything, that the opinions of these people had no reach over her. She had come here wearing $412 of armor. She looked at the man across from her who had crossed 11 time zones for an umbrella and an hour of conversation. She said, with more precision than the question perhaps required, "What do you want from me?" He looked at her for a long moment, not performing consideration, actually taking the question seriously enough to hold it before answering. I want, he said, to start from the beginning, whatever that means to you. I'm not asking for anything except the chance to let you know who I am, the full version. A pause. And perhaps to be in the same city as someone who once found me sitting on a step in the rain and decided, for no reason that benefited her, to stay. Zuri's hands were still flat on the table. Her face was still composed. Inside her chest, something was doing something she wasn't ready to name. That's a lot, she said. I know, he said. You can't just fly across the world and show up at someone's reunion. I know. And announce that you've been looking for them for months. I know. And expect that to land as anything other than, Zuri. She stopped. He said quietly, I know. And I did it anyway. The room shifted again, not the ambient room, the room of the ballroom and the orchids and the string lights. The room of the conversation. Something changed inside the perimeter of the table where they were sitting, some pressure differential, like a storm deciding which direction to move. She said, You should know that I had a terrible evening before you came in. I know, he said. I know what was being said to you. She went still in a different way. You were here early, long enough. She processed this. The thought of this man, this particular person who had spent 8 months looking for her, who had flown from wherever he'd been to Atlanta, who had stood somewhere in this ballroom before she'd seen him, standing within earshot of Victoria's conversation. Hearing those words, knowing what they'd said about no man wanting a woman like that, and then walking through the room to find her anyway. She said, You heard all of it. Yes. And you still walked over. He looked at her with those dark, tired, intensely serious eyes. Zuri, he said, I crossed the world to get here. She was going to say something else. She had a response already forming, something measured and sensible and appropriately skeptical, because she was a measured and sensible woman, and she had not survived everything she'd survived by abandoning those qualities for a man who knew how to sit very still and say things with conviction. She was going to say it, and then Victoria appeared at their table. She came from the left, and she came with the kind of social confidence that doesn't recognize the possibility of its own unwelcomeness, wearing a smile that had been calibrated over a lifetime to land as warmth while delivering something else entirely. She looked at Juntae with that specific expression of beautiful women who have always understood their beauty as a resource, and she said, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm Victoria Ashcroft. I don't think we've been introduced. She extended her hand to him. She did not look at Zuri. Juntae looked at Victoria's extended hand for 1 beat, 2 beats, long enough that the room noticed the pause, long enough that Victoria's smile became something she had to hold in place rather than something that was simply there. He looked back at Zuri. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen yet. Not coldness exactly, more like the particular kind of stillness that lives on the far side of patience. He did not take Victoria's hand. I'm having a private conversation, he said to Victoria. His voice had not changed in volume or pitch, but something in it had shifted in a way that made the ambient noise in the nearest radius of the room drop by several degrees. Victoria's smile recalibrated. A fraction of a second, visible only if you were watching for it, and Zuri was watching for it. Of course, I apologize. I just wanted to say, I heard what you wanted to say, Juntae said. Earlier this evening, I heard all of it. The silence that followed was very specific. It had a texture and a weight. Victoria said, I'm not sure what you think you heard. I'm sure you're not, he said, and turned back to Zuri with the finality of a door closing, and said, in a voice pitched low enough for her only, Would you like to get out of here? Zuri looked at Victoria, who was standing at the edge of their table with nowhere to go and the entire watching room behind her. Then she looked at Seo Juntae, who had flown across the world for an umbrella and an hour of conversation and was now asking her if she wanted to leave a reunion that had tried its best to make her feel like nothing. She picked up her clutch from the table. She stood. She said to no one in particular, but to everyone listening, I think I'm done here. They walked through the ballroom together, and the room parted for them the way rooms parted for people who were not asking permission. And Zuri did not look at Victoria, and she did not look at Marcus Delaney or Candace Whitfield or any of the faces she'd spent all evening navigating. She walked with her chin level and her spine straight and her armor on, but something underneath the armor had shifted in the last 40 minutes, had rearranged itself without her consent, and she wasn't sure yet whether that was dangerous. Outside, the Atlanta air was warm and smelled of Bradford pears and car exhaust and spring. 2 black vehicles sat at the curb. The door to the first one was already open. Juntae stood beside the door and looked at her. Zuri stood on the marble steps and looked back at him. Behind the glass doors of the hotel, she could see the shapes of people watching from the ballroom. She said, I need you to understand that I don't know you. I know that an hour in Seoul in the rain doesn't mean I trust you. I know. And that whatever you are, whatever your business is, that's not nothing to me. That's a real thing I need real information about. Yes, he said. I'll give you all of it, whatever you want to know. She looked at the open door. She looked at him. She looked at the city stretching out behind him in the warm dark, Atlanta glowing, all that familiar skyline she'd watched from the window of a converted garage on Edgewood Avenue, and told herself, "This is mine. I'm building something here." "Where are we going?" she said. He said a name, a restaurant she recognized, a place in Inman Park, small, private, the kind of place where you could have a conversation without an audience. He said it with the matter-of-factness of a man who had already done more research than one conversation justified. And under different circumstances, she might have found that alarming, and in some part of herself she still did. She stepped off the marble stairs. She moved toward the car, and she was reaching for the door frame when her phone buzzed with a message notification, and she glanced at it reflexively, the way you do when your hands are already moving, and she saw the name on the screen, a name she hadn't expected to see tonight, a name attached to a history she'd closed a door on 2 years ago. And the message below it, "We need to talk, not here. It's about him. I know who he is. You need to know what you're walking into." She looked up. Juntae was watching her. Not the phone, not the screen, just her face, reading it with the attention of a man who understood that something had just happened. "Problem?" he said. Zuri looked at the message. She looked at him. She put the phone in her clutch and said, "Let's go," and got in the car. The car moved through Atlanta's spring night, and Zuri sat with her clutch in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and her phone inside it, and the message inside the phone, and the name attached to the message, like a hook that had gone in clean and was now sitting in something important. She didn't take the phone back out. Juntae sat across from her. The car was large enough that they faced each other rather than sitting side by side, which she was grateful for because it meant she didn't have to manage peripheral awareness of him on top of everything else. He was looking out the window at the city moving past, or he appeared to be, and she had the strong instinct that he was actually watching her reflection in the glass. One of his men was in the front passenger seat, the driver she couldn't read from this angle. No one was speaking. She said, "Who betrayed you?" He turned from the window. "In Seoul," she said. "The person you mentioned. The lieutenant. The friend since 18. What happened to him?" A pause that lasted 2 full city blocks. "He's no longer a concern." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at her steadily. "He's alive. That was a decision I made. Not everyone agreed with it. Your organization didn't think he should be alive." "Correct. But you kept him alive." "I sent him away, with enough to live on and enough warning to understand what would happen if he surfaced again." He said it without inflection, without the performance of either mercy or threat. "He had a daughter, 8 years old. I knew her since she was born." Zuri absorbed this. "So, you're not entirely without—" she started. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't decide what that means about me. It means exactly what it is. One decision about one specific person. My organization runs on consequences. I didn't invent that, and I don't apologize for it. I wasn't going to say you were a good person. What were you going to say? That you're a complicated one." She held his gaze. "Which I already knew. You told me that yourself. In the parking lot equivalent of full disclosure, which I appreciate, but appreciating honesty isn't the same as being comfortable with what you were honest about." "I know." "So why tell me?" "Because you asked," he said, "and because I'm not interested in starting whatever this is on a foundation I built out of omission." The car slowed. Outside, Inman Park materialized in the familiar way it always did at night. The old craftsman houses set back from the sidewalk. The particular warmth of it, the way this neighborhood had always felt to Zuri like Atlanta before Atlanta got too loud. The restaurant was a converted Victorian on a corner lot, the kind of place with no sign visible from the street, where the reservation system operated by referral in the dining room, had 8 tables, and the chef was someone who cooked food that tasted like it had been thought about by a person rather than engineered for a demographic. She'd been here twice, both times with people she'd been trying to impress. She said, "How did you know about this place?" "Research." "Into me." "Yes." She sat with that. "How much?" "Enough to find you, your firm, your work, your professional presence. Not—" He paused, precise about it. "Not your private life. I wasn't interested in your personal history from a database. I wanted that from you." There's something deeply strange about that distinction. "I know." The door was opened from outside. One of his men, she realized, had exited the car ahead of them and positioned himself at the restaurant entrance with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Juntae got out first and offered his hand, and she looked at it for a moment before taking it. Just a moment, just long enough to be clear that she was making a choice rather than an automatic response. His hand was warm, and the grip was careful. She let go as soon as she was on the sidewalk. The restaurant had been cleared. She understood it as soon as they walked in. The empty tables, the staff moving with the particular focused quiet of people who had been given instructions and a significant gratuity to follow them. And she stopped inside the door. "You called ahead," she said. "Yes." "You reserved the entire restaurant. I wanted privacy for the conversation." She turned to look at him. "You did this before you came to find me, before you knew whether I'd come." Something moved in his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like the acknowledgement of a valid point. "I was optimistic." That's one word for it. She looked around at the empty room, 8 tables dressed and lit, a fire in the small fireplace at the far wall, the smell of whatever the kitchen was preparing, something rich and warm. What if I'd said no? "Then I would have eaten alone," he said, "and found another way to talk to you tomorrow." "You assumed there would be a tomorrow." "I hoped." She walked to the table nearest the fireplace because it felt like the most honest choice. She wanted the light. She wanted to see his face clearly. And she sat and placed her clutch on the table beside her and unfolded the napkin in her lap, and tried to locate the version of herself that ran a 12-person firm and negotiated with contractors, and didn't feel the specific, inconvenient electricity of being in a room alone with a man who had flown across the world to find her. She found that version, wore it like the dress, armor over armor. He sat across from her and looked at her with that serious, unhurried attention. She said, "Tell me about the business." "Which part?" "The part that doesn't go in annual reports." He was quiet for a moment. The fire made small sounds. Somewhere in the kitchen, something sizzled briefly and went quiet. "My family has operated in Korea for 4 generations," he said. "My great-grandfather built the original business during the occupation. Legitimate trade, supply chain, survival-based logistics that became structurally important to certain power networks. By my grandfather's generation, it had formalized. By my father's, it was extensive." A pause. "I took control at 26, after my father had a health crisis. The organization was in the middle of a territory conflict that had been mismanaged for 2 years. I ended it. How? Strategically. Some of it was negotiation, some of it was not." He said this with the same flatness. "I'm not going to give you a ledger of what I've done, Zuri. I'll answer what you ask directly. I won't volunteer the parts that are designed to make you see me in a specific light." "Fair," she said. "What's your legitimate footprint? 3 hotel groups across Asia and Europe, a shipping consortium, private security, corporate, and residential. Real estate development in Seoul, Tokyo, Singapore, and Berlin. Collectively about 4,000 employees who have no knowledge of the other side of it. And the other side, distribution networks, protection arrangements, financial services that operate outside regulatory frameworks." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to explain it to you as though it's something other than what it is." Zuri looked at him. She said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer it exactly." "Yes." "Has anyone been hurt because of a decision you made? Directly. Not operationally, not theoretically. Directly, with your knowledge and your authorization." The fire made its small sounds. He said, "Yes." She held the silence. "More than once," he said. "Fewer times than most people in my position. More times than I could justify to someone who lives outside it." He did not look away. "I'm not asking you to accept that. I'm telling you so that you're not building something on ground that turns out to be different than you thought it was." Zuri's hands were in her lap, and the champagne from earlier had long since metabolized, and she was entirely, uncomfortably sober. She said, "Why me? Genuinely. Why not?" She gestured vaguely. "Someone who already lives in your world. Someone who understands the architecture of it." "Because the people who already understand the architecture of it," he said, "look at me and see what I'm worth to them. What access I represent. What protection or power or proximity to power." He paused. "You sat down next to a man on a step in the rain because he looked like he was having the worst day of his life. You had no idea who I was. You didn't want anything. You just stayed." He was quiet for a moment. Do you understand how rare that is in my specific life? Do you understand how long it had been since someone just stayed? She understood. She understood it in the precise way she understood load-bearing structures. Not because she'd been told to, but because she could see it, could trace the weight distribution, could see exactly where the pressure was going. She said, I need you to understand something about me. Tell me. I've spent 12 years building something on my own. I started with nothing that was given to me, and I built everything I have by being correct more often than I was wrong, and by working harder than the room, and by not needing things that needed to be asked for. She paused. I don't have a complicated relationship with being alone. I don't need rescuing. I'm not looking for someone to make the room pay attention to me, which is what tonight looked like from the outside, and which is not, she stopped, which is not what I want this to be. What do you want it to be? She sat with the question. The honest answer was sitting right there, visible and inconvenient, and she was 48 hours from having an architecture competition brief due and 3 days from a site walkthrough in Midtown that required her full cognitive capacity. And this man across from her was the kind of complexity that consumed cognitive capacity the way a renovation project consumed contingency budget. I don't know yet, she said. That's honest? I'm always honest, she said. It's not a virtue. It's just what I have time for. Something in his face shifted. Not the gravity that seemed structural, permanent, like it had been built in a long time ago, but something adjacent to warmth, something she'd seen once on the pharmacy step when he'd almost smiled and decided against it. He said, the woman at the reunion, Victoria. Zuri's jaw tightened by a small degree. What about her? What is she to you? Nothing. A classmate. Someone who made college less comfortable than it needed to be, and who apparently hasn't changed. She matters to you, he said. Not accusatory, observational. She doesn't. You tensed when I said her name. I tense at a lot of things. It's not an endorsement of their significance. He looked at her for a moment. The things she said tonight, about no man wanting a woman like you, don't. He stopped. Don't, she said again, not with heat, but with something more final. I don't need you to address that. I heard it. I've heard versions of it for years. I don't need a powerful man to swoop in and rebut it on my behalf, because that would mean giving it more weight than it deserves, and it doesn't deserve my weight, let alone yours. A pause. Understood, he said. Good. They ate. A server appeared from somewhere and placed food in front of them with quiet efficiency and disappeared again, and they ate and talked about things that were smaller and more navigable. She told him about the firm, about a mixed-use development in Castleberry Hill she was particularly invested in, about the frustration of getting city approval on anything that deviated from the conservative visual language that Atlanta's permitting offices seemed to believe was architecture. He listened with the attention of someone who was actually interested, asking questions that demonstrated he'd retained what she'd said, rather than just waiting for his turn. He told her about Seoul, about a hotel project in Berlin that had gone sideways because of a zoning issue he'd been managing for 2 years, about a property in Singapore that he'd designed with a specific architect whose name she recognized and whose work she admired, and she caught herself leaning slightly forward without intending to. It was only when the plates had been cleared and the restaurant had grown quieter around them that she remembered the message. She took out her phone. She looked at it. The name was Derek Okonkwo. Derek, who had been genuinely kind to her in college. Derek, who she'd talked to for 20 warm minutes tonight about his West Africa project before everything had changed. Derek, who had no apparent reason to know anything about Seo Juntae, except that he was standing in that ballroom when Juntae walked in, and she'd watched Derek's face change in a way she'd registered but not categorized at the time. Had filed it under general shock before the larger shock of being recognized had overtaken everything. She looked at the message again. We need to talk. Not here. It's about him. I know who he is. You need to know what you're walking into. She put the phone face down on the table. She said, Do you know a man named Derek Okonkwo? The change was instantaneous and absolute, not dramatic. He didn't move, didn't stiffen, didn't do any of the physical things that would have been legible from a distance. It was something more internal, some fundamental shift in the quality of his stillness, and she'd been watching him carefully enough all evening to read it. He said, Why? One word. The flatness had changed, something underneath it. He was at the reunion tonight, she said. He's someone I know from college. He sent me a message about an hour ago. She watched his face. He says he knows who you are. Juntae was quiet. June. She used the name deliberately, the name from the step, the name without the full architecture of who he was attached to it. Do you know him? He said. What did the message say? Exactly. That I need to know what I'm walking into. Something moved in his jaw. Minimal, controlled, the kind of muscle movement that happened when a person was constraining a larger response down to something manageable. He said, Derek Okonkwo worked for 2 years as a logistics consultant for a subsidiary of one of my European shipping companies. He was removed from that position 14 months ago. Why? A pause. Because we discovered he was passing information about our shipping routes to a competitor organization, a rival network operating out of Busan in Los Angeles. He held her gaze. He was not harmed. He was dismissed. He understood the terms. And one of the terms was that he would have no further contact with anyone connected to my operations. His voice was level. Zuri, his being at that reunion tonight was not a coincidence. That specific reunion, your specific reunion. She sat very still. He knew I was looking for you, Juntae said. He knew before I found you, which means the people he works for, the people he was passing information to, knew about my search before tonight. He paused. I need to know what the full message says. She looked at him. She picked up the phone and turned it around so he could read the screen. His eyes moved across the text once, twice. His expression didn't change. He set the phone down and didn't give it back immediately, and she watched him do a calculation she couldn't follow, something running behind his eyes that was faster and colder than conversation. Then he slid the phone back to her side of the table. He said, We need to leave. Now? Yes. What's the rival network I mentioned? His voice was still controlled, but something in it had changed pitch, moved lower and quieter and more final. They've been trying to locate a specific piece of documentation that my organization holds, evidence of their financial operation that, if it surfaces in the right places, ends them. They've known for months that I've been distracted, searching for something personal. He stood. Me being here, in Atlanta, in public, visible, it's the first time in 8 months I've been somewhere they could place me with certainty. Zuri stood because he was standing and because the room had changed around her in a way that her body understood before her mind did. You think they sent Derek to... I think Derek Okonkwo was in that ballroom for a reason that had nothing to do with your class reunion. He reached into his jacket and said something quietly to the man who had materialized, apparently from nowhere, at the edge of the dining room. Then he looked at her. I am sorry. I am sorry that I brought this to your door. I need you to come with me now, and I need to make some calls, and I need to get you somewhere that isn't visible. I'm not going to an undisclosed location because, Zuri. His voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It had the specific quality of a very heavy door closing on a very tight seal. I am asking you to trust me for the next 45 minutes. I know I haven't earned that yet. I know exactly what I'm asking. He looked at her with the full weight of those dark, serious eyes. I need you to trust me anyway. Outside on the quiet Inman Park street, something moved. She didn't see it. She felt it, felt the subtle shift in the men near the door, the way one of them put a hand to his ear, the way the other one moved from the entrance to the window in a single smooth step that was nothing like casual. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Another message from Derek. He found you. They know. Do not get in his car. Call me. You don't know what happened in Berlin. She looked up at Juntae. He was watching her face, reading it. He said, What does it say? She looked at the message. She looked at him. She looked at the man at the window who was looking at the street with an expression that had no casual in it anywhere. She said, What happened in Berlin? And the way the light left his face when she said it was the most frightening thing she'd seen all night. The silence after she said it lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted them without meaning to, the way you count the gap between lightning and thunder, not because you want to know the distance, but because your body needs something to do while it waits to understand how bad this is going to be. Juntae's face did not collapse. It did not perform distress. It did the thing she was beginning to recognize as his specific response to damage. It went very, very still, the way a building goes still in the seconds before an engineer determines whether it's standing or falling, when all the movement has stopped and you're waiting on the structural verdict. He said, Put the phone away. Tell me what happened in Berlin. Put the phone away first. That's not how this works. She kept the phone in her hand and kept her eyes on him and tried to locate the version of herself that was not standing in a cleared restaurant in Inman Park with men at the windows and a message from a man she'd trusted in college telling her that the person across from her was something she hadn't been told about yet. You said no omission. You said you weren't going to build this on ground that was different than I thought. So tell me what happened in Berlin. He looked at her for one more second. Then he turned to the man nearest the door and said something in Korean, clipped 3 or 4 words. And the man nodded and moved, and Zuri heard the front door open and close behind her. They were alone. He sat back down, not because he was relaxed. The tension in him was architectural, load-bearing. It wasn't going anywhere, but because he was making a deliberate choice to reduce the physical disparity, to come down to her level, to do this without the advantage of height and standing. She sat too, because her knees wanted her to. He said, "The Berlin project, the hotel development I mentioned. There was a man attached to it, a structural engineer I'd worked with for 6 years. His name was Henrik Maher. He was the one who introduced me to the rival network, though I didn't know that at the time. He was feeding them information about our European operations, the same way Okonkwo was feeding them shipping data." He paused. "When we discovered it 18 months ago, I was in Berlin. I went to speak to him directly. And the conversation did not end well." She said, "Define that." "He drew a weapon. The situation escalated. He did not survive it. The fire had burned lower. Zuri was aware of it in the peripheral way she was aware of everything right now. The room, the windows, the sound of the city outside, the weight of her phone in her hand. She said, "You killed him." My security responded to an immediate threat. I was present when it happened. He held her gaze without apology and without performance. "That is what happened in Berlin." She set the phone on the table. She looked at the grain of the tablecloth. White linen, slightly irregular, handmade probably. The kind of details she'd normally notice with professional appreciation. She stared at it and let her mind do what it needed to do with the information she'd just been given, which was to run it through every framework she had for what a person did with a fact like that, a fact about someone sitting 3 feet away from her. She said, "Derek knew about this. Okonkwo's handlers knew, which means he knew or was told enough to use it. And he's using it to warn me off." "He's using it," Juntae said carefully, "to destabilize you, to make you afraid of me. Not because he's protecting you, Zuri. Because if you run from me tonight, I leave Atlanta alone, and I'm easier to track when I'm—" Her phone screen lit up. An incoming call. "Derek." She stared at it. Juntae said, "Don't eat." She picked it up. She answered it. She said, "Derek." His voice came through tight and low, like he was in a small space or trying not to be overheard. "Zuri, thank God. Are you still with him?" "Tell me what you know," she said. "I don't have a lot of time." "Listen to me. Seo Juntae is not what he told you he is. The legitimate businesses are real, but they're a shell. The actual revenue comes from supply chain interference, from extortion frameworks across 3 continents. A man died in Berlin because he tried to leave his orbit. His own people have disappeared when they stopped being useful." A pause, the sound of movement on his end, something like footsteps on a hard floor. "I worked for a subsidiary of his operation for 2 years. I saw the documentation. I know what the network looks like from inside. You need to get out of wherever you are right now." She looked at Juntae. He was watching her face with the focus of someone reading a text he couldn't hear. She said into the phone, "Where are you?" "Hotel around the corner from the Whitmore, room 412. Come alone. Don't tell him where—" "Derek," she kept her voice flat. "You told me not to get in his car. I'm already not in his car. I'm in a restaurant. Why are you calling from inside a hotel room at 11 at night on the night of a class reunion if this was just about warning me?" Silence on the line. Brief. Maybe 2 seconds. But she'd been doing this long enough, running a business, reading rooms, reading people, to know what 2 seconds of unexpected silence meant. It meant the script had moved off the expected track and someone was recalibrating. "I was worried," Derek said. "You were at the reunion," she said. "I saw you. You had a whole conversation with me about your project in West Africa. You seemed fine. Happy, even. And then a powerful man walked in and you sent me a message and now you're in a hotel room." She paused. "That's a very specific set of coincidences, Derek." Another pause, shorter this time. The sound of breathing. Then, Zuri, I'm trying to help you. I know you are, she said. I just don't know who asked you to. She ended the call. She put the phone face down on the table and pressed the heel of her hand against it like she was holding something down, and she looked at Juntae and said, He's in a hotel room. Around the corner. He wants me to come alone. Juntae said nothing. That's a trap, she said. Isn't it? Yes. He was placed at the reunion. He made contact with me before you arrived. Built the friendly history back up, so I'd trust the message. She heard herself saying it, heard the architecture of it assembling, the way a structural failure assembled in retrospect, all the load paths that had been compromised before the collapse made them visible. They knew you were coming to Atlanta. They knew about me. They set this up before tonight. Yes. She pressed harder on the phone. How long have they known about me? I don't know. Guess. He looked at her steadily. Since I started looking for you, possibly from the beginning, my search generated activity. Database inquiries, travel, communications. If they had someone inside my network, which they did, in at least 2 positions I've since identified, they would have been watching for anything personal, anything that could be used as leverage. He paused. You became visible to them the moment you became visible to me. The low fire popped once. Zuri took her hand off the phone. She said, This was never just a reunion and a man who remembered me from Seoul. From the moment you started looking, I was already in the middle of something. Yes, he said, and I'm sorry. I made that decision without being able to consult you, and I would make it again because finding you was... I would make it again. But I'm sorry for what it's cost you without your knowledge. She stood. She walked to the window, not the one his man had been watching, but the one on the side wall, the one that looked out onto the adjacent street, and she looked at the dark and the quiet and the trees and tried to think with the clarity she used when a project was going wrong on site. Not panicking, not catastrophizing, just identifying the actual load-bearing problem and working from there. She said to the window, What do they want tonight, specifically? What's the play? She heard him stand. He came to stand near her, not beside her, a few feet back, giving her the space she hadn't asked for, but that he'd apparently learned, in the past 3 hours, that she needed when she was thinking. They want me isolated, out of my network, in an unfamiliar city, with a personal distraction and a reason to be careless. A pause. There's a server, a physical drive containing the financial documentation I mentioned. It's been in a secure location in Seoul for 2 years. 2 days ago, it was moved. I was told it was moved to a secondary location for security. I authorized the move. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it had shifted, had tightened towards something she recognized as the specific sound a person made when they'd begun to understand the shape of how they'd been fooled. I got a communication 4 hours ago before I arrived at the reunion from my head of operations in Seoul. She told me the drive arrived safely at the secondary location. But, Zuri said, but my head of operations in Seoul is a woman named Park Ji-soo, who has worked for me for 7 years and whose communication protocols I know as precisely as my own. A pause. The message I received used the correct encryption and the correct sign-offs, but it used a phrase that Ji-soo and I established 18 months ago as a duress signal, a phrase you include when you're being coerced to send a message that isn't true. The quiet of the restaurant was absolute. She sent you a distress signal, Zuri said, embedded in what was designed to read as a routine confirmation. His voice was, if anything, quieter, which means the drive has not been secured, which means Park Ji-soo is in a situation I need to address immediately, which means tonight, this specific evening, the rival network has managed to simultaneously compromise my Seoul operation, position an asset in the same building as my personal search in Atlanta, and create a situation designed to keep me here, distracted and reactive. While his phone buzzed, he looked at it. Whatever was on the screen did something to his face that she'd not seen yet. She said, What? He turned the phone toward her. A photograph, taken from the timestamp 47 minutes ago. A parking structure, fluorescent lit, concrete pillars. 2 figures. One of them she didn't recognize. One of them she did. Victoria Ashcroft. And the man she was standing with was not anyone from the reunion. He was Korean, mid-40s, wearing a jacket that sat too high at the collar, the way jackets sat when there was something under them that added bulk. He was handing Victoria an envelope, and Victoria was holding it with the specific careful grip of someone who understood it was significant. Zuri stared at the photograph. "Victoria," she said. The word came out with a texture she hadn't expected. "Her family has financial exposure," Juntae said. "The Ashcroft family has been in a credit position with a European fund that I now believe is a front for the rival network. Her father has been in that position for 4 years." His voice had gone somewhere colder. "She was at the reunion for the same reason Okonkwo was. She knew you were coming. She knew I was coming. She was positioned to—" He stopped. Something was working behind his eyes, something connecting. "She was the first one to approach our table. After you and I sat down. You shut her down." "I did." He looked at the photograph, which means she went to the parking structure within the hour and collected a secondary instruction. They're adapting. Zuri looked at the photograph and thought about Victoria's voice carrying across the ballroom, calibrated and careful. No man would want a woman like that. She thought about the specific cruelty of it, the precision, the way it had landed not because Victoria was careless, but because Victoria was practiced. She said, "Was any of it real? Her being at that reunion, the things she said to me? Was any of it just ordinary cruelty, or was all of it—" "I don't know," he said. "I think some people are both things at once. I think she may have believed what she said and also been there for a reason. That was almost worse. That was exactly worse." Zuri turned from the window. She looked at the room, the empty tables, the low fire, the cleared plates of a dinner that had cost her the last of her certainty that tonight was something she had any control over. She looked at Juntae, who was standing with his phone in his hand and the photograph on the screen and the specific expression of a man who was running 3 separate disasters through his head simultaneously and managing, barely, to remain vertical. She said, "Park Ji-soo, you're head of operations. What happens to her if you don't respond?" His jaw did the small controlled thing. "That's what I thought," she said. "So you need to deal with Seoul. I need to deal with multiple things simultaneously, and I have limited people in Atlanta I can call them. There are communication security concerns. My Seoul network may be—" "Jun-yi?" She walked toward him, not close, just close enough to make the conversation direct. "I understand that you have a crisis that is significantly larger than me. I understand that Park Ji-soo is in a situation that needs your attention and that the documentation you mentioned is the actual strategic problem and that I am—" she gestured at herself— "an architect from Atlanta who is a personal distraction in the middle of a serious operational failure." She looked at him squarely. "I'm not going to Derek's hotel room. I'm not going anywhere until I understand what's actually happening. But you need to make your calls." He looked at her. Something in his face shifted with a slowness that felt fundamental. He said, "I'm not going to treat you as a distraction. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to not treat me as something fragile you have to manage while the real problem happens somewhere else." She held his gaze. "What can I do?" He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Derek Okonkwo is in that hotel room because they want me to go there. To be drawn into a direct confrontation in an environment they've chosen." He looked at the phone. "But Okonkwo was also inside my operation for 2 years. He has information about my Seoul network, about the documentation, about Jisoo's position and protocols. If I could speak to him without it being on their terms—" "He called me," Zuri said. "He trusts me enough to use me as the route to you. Or he thinks he does." She paused. "Call him back on my phone. Different number than his handlers are monitoring. If I initiate the contact, they're expecting me to come alone." "No," he said, immediate, flat. "It's a phone call. Not, no." The word had a different quality than his previous no's. It had the quality of something non-negotiable. Not control. She recognized control, had spent years dismantling it wherever it appeared in her professional and personal life, and this was not the same. This was fear, moving through him in the contained, disciplined way that fear moved through people who had learned not to let it show. "I will not use you as an operational asset. That is not what this is." She stood in the space of that sentence. He said quieter, "I came here for you, not to build a new resource. I will not make you into one." The fire made its sounds. She said, "Then what are we doing?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then his phone buzzed again. He looked at it. This time, she didn't ask what it said. She watched his face read the screen, and she watched something drain out of it. Not color, not expression, but some essential quality, the specific light that a person carried when they still believed they had time. He looked up. He said, Jisoo sent a second message. What does it say? He turned the phone. 4 words. They have the drive. Zuri looked at the 4 words. She looked at Juntae. His face was entirely still. She had the sense she was watching a man stand at the exact center of everything he'd built and understand in real time, that the ground beneath it had been cut. Outside on the quiet street, she heard the sound of a car. More than one. Juntae turned toward the window with the unhurried precision of a man moving from decision into action, and he said without looking at her, in the voice that was quieter than anything else had been all night, Zuri, I need you to do exactly what I say for the next 60 seconds. She said, talk. He was already moving, already at the side door that she hadn't noticed before, the one that was flush with the paneling and looked like a wall until it didn't, and he pushed it open and the Atlanta night came through it, warm and loud with the sound of the cars on the street getting closer. 2 of them, maybe 3, and he turned back to her with his hand on the door frame and said, stay behind me. Don't stop moving. Don't speak until we're in the second vehicle. She didn't argue. She moved. The alley behind the restaurant was narrow and smelled of the city's organic underbelly, dumpster and damp concrete, and the diesel exhaust of the street parallel to them. And she was in heels, $412 dress, which was not how she would have chosen to run if she'd known running was on the agenda. But she adjusted, shortened her stride, hit the balls of her feet instead of the heels, felt the specific misery of brick underneath thin leather soles, and filed it under problems that were not the main problem. Juntae's man, she'd started thinking of him as the quiet one because she'd never heard him speak, was already in the alley, and there was a second car she hadn't seen before, black, engine running, parked half on the curb in the way that meant someone had gotten here fast. She got in. The door closed. The car moved before she'd fully processed sitting down, and she grabbed the handle above the window and looked through the rear glass at the street behind them, at the 2 vehicles that had pulled up to the front of the restaurant, at the figures getting out of them. 4, 5, she couldn't be precise, moving toward the entrance. Who are they? She said. The network's retrieval team. Juntae was on his phone, speaking Korean, short sentences, the tone of someone giving instructions under compression. He listened, said something else, listened again, then lowered the phone and looked at her. They have Jisoo. They have the drive. They're here to leverage both. The drive to destroy my network's legal exposure, Jisoo to keep me from responding until it's done. Where is she? Seoul. A location my contact is trying to identify. Your contact in Seoul. Someone outside my primary network. Someone the rival organization doesn't know about. He looked out the window, the city moving past, Inman Park giving way to the industrial edge of Reynoldstown. I have maybe 90 minutes before the drive is accessed, and the documentation is either destroyed or sold. If they sell it, it goes to parties who will use it to dismantle everything I've built in Europe and expose operations that would... He stopped. That would harm people who have nothing to do with the organizational side. Staff. Families of staff. So you need the drive back. I need Jisoo back. The drive is secondary. She heard it in his voice, the specific frequency of a person who had already decided what they were willing to lose and was working from that decision forward. She said, Where are we going? The Whitmore Grand. She turned. The Reunion Hotel? Derek Okonkwo is in room 412, he said. He has information about the Seoul location. He was the logistics coordinator for European operations. He would have handled the routing documentation for the secondary location the drive was moved to. He knows where Jisoo is being held, even if he doesn't know he knows. He looked at her. And he will talk to you in a way he won't talk to me. She held the door handle and felt the city moving under the car and thought about what he was asking. You said you wouldn't make me an operational asset, she said. I know what I said. That was 20 minutes ago. I know. His voice was tight, not with dishonesty, with the specific tightness of a man who was watching his principles collide with his reality at high speed. I'm asking, not directing. If you say no, I find another way. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, What's the play? Something shifted in his face, relief and something more complicated moving beneath it. You call him. Tell him you got away from me. Tell him you're coming up alone. Get him talking about the Seoul operation. He'll want to establish his credibility with you. He'll want to prove he was right about me. People talk when they're proving a point. He paused. I'll be in the hallway. That's thin, she said. Yes. If he's working for people who just sent a retrieval team to a restaurant in Inman Park, there may be someone else in that room. Yes. And your plan for that is? Me, in the hallway. She looked at him. She said, I need better shoes. The Whitmore Grand was still lit up and still running, the reunion technically ongoing on the ballroom level, which meant the lobby was active enough that 3 people moving through it with purpose didn't register as unusual. Juntae stayed at the elevator bank with the quiet one while she went ahead, phone to her ear, walking like a woman who was going to a specific place and not a woman whose heart rate was doing something she didn't have language for. She called Derek from the elevator. He picked up on the first ring. I'm coming up, she said. I'm alone. A beat. What happened? I made an excuse. I said I needed air. I walked out. She kept her voice controlled, kept it in the register of someone who was shaken but moving. Room 412. Yes, hurry. She came off the elevator on the 4th floor, and the hallway was empty, cream carpet and wall sconces, and the particular muffled quiet of hotels at night, every door closed on someone else's contained world. She counted room numbers without appearing to count them, past 406, 408, 410, and stopped at 412 with her hand raised to knock and felt, in the half-second before her knuckles connected with the door, the specific physical reality of what she was doing. She knocked. The door opened. Derek Okonkwo looked worse than he had at the reunion. The warmth she'd registered earlier in the evening was still there, but underneath it was something frayed, something that had been under pressure for longer than tonight. He was in his shirt sleeves, jacket discarded, and he had the particular appearance of a man who had been sitting in a room with a bad decision for several hours and was starting to understand its dimensions. He looked past her into the hallway. You're alone, he said. I told you I would be. He let her in. The room was a standard hotel room, standard Atlanta business tier. 1 king bed with the cover undisturbed, a desk with his jacket on the chair and a laptop open, a small seating area near the window. She noted the positions of things. The window, the bathroom door, the only exit at her back, the way she noted structural elements on a site visit, automatically, without making it visible. 1 person. Just Derek. She let her breath settle by a single degree. She sat in the chair near the window without being invited. He sat on the edge of the bed facing her, forearms on his knees, the position of a man who was about to deliver something and wasn't sure how it was going to land. Tell me about Berlin, she said, giving him the opening, letting him run at it. He ran at it. He told her about Henrik Marr, about the night in Berlin, about the documentation he'd seen moving through logistics channels that described a disposal rather than a defensive response. He was credible. He had details, dates, a specificity that wasn't constructed. She believed that he believed it. She said, The drive. The financial documentation Juntae mentioned. Do you know where it is? He stopped. He looked at her. He told you about the drive, Derek said. Yes. He told you it was moved. He told me it was taken. She watched his face. Derek, I need to know if you know where Park Ji-soo is being held. The fraying under his surface became visible. Something moved in his jaw, behind his eyes, the specific physical expression of a person who had just understood that the conversation had not gone the direction that was planned. How do you know about Ji-soo? He said. Because I've been sitting with him for 2 hours and he told me things. Because he doesn't operate the way you told me he operates. She leaned forward slightly. And because you're scared right now, and it's not of him. It's of whatever you're going to have to tell the people who put you in this room if you don't deliver what they sent you here to deliver. Derek stood up. He walked to the window and put his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and the tension moving through them and waited. He said, I didn't know they were going to take her. But you knew about the drive move. A long pause. I provided the routing information for the secondary location. They told me it was they said it was an extraction operation. Secure the evidence, neutralize his leverage over the network. His voice had gone rough. They didn't say anything about taking his people. Where is she, Derek? He turned. His face had the quality of someone who had just discovered the thing they'd agreed to was several sizes larger than the box they'd been handed. A warehouse facility. Domdong District, Seoul. My contact gave me the address as confirmation of delivery. I wasn't supposed to need it, but I kept it because He stopped. Because I'm not entirely. He stopped again. Because you're not entirely sure about the people you're working for, she said. He looked at her. She said quietly, "Give me the address, Derek." The door came open. Not her door. The connecting door to the adjacent room, the one she hadn't clocked as a connecting door because it had been flush and locked and invisible until it wasn't, and the man who came through it was the same man from the photographs, Korean, mid-40s, the jacket that sat too high. And he had something in his hand, and the something was pointed at Derek, and he said, in English that was flat and entirely without accent, "She's not alone." Derek went white. Zuri did not move. The man looked at her. "Phone on the bed." She put her phone on the bed. "Where is he?" She said, "I don't know what you mean." He looked at her with the specific expression of a person who had no interest in the performance. "Seo Juntai. He's in the building." "I came alone." "You came from a car that left Inman Park 6 minutes after our team arrived. You came up the elevator with a key card that someone else activated from the lobby level." He looked at Derek. "You told her about Domdong." Derek said nothing. His silence was its own kind of answer. The man moved toward the window and looked down at the street, a brief scan, professional, and then turned back into the room and said into a device at his collar, something in Korean, and Zuri heard a response come back that she couldn't translate, but whose tone she understood. They knew Juntae was in the building. They knew exactly where. She looked at her phone on the bed. She looked at Derek, who was standing with his arms slightly away from his body, and the expression of a man watching the floor give way and not knowing which direction to fall. She made a decision. She stood up, which was not what anyone expected, and she said to the man with the weapon with the full register voice she used when a contractor had given her bad information on a load-bearing wall, and she needed the room to understand the severity immediately. "My name is Zuri Holloway. I run a 12-person architectural firm in Atlanta. I don't work for Seo Juntae. I'm not an operative, and I'm not a combatant, and whatever this is, I'm not part of it." The man looked at her with the flat assessment of someone cataloging information. She kept going. "But I am the reason he's in Atlanta. I'm the reason he's in this building. And I'm telling you that if you move against him in this hotel, in this city, you create an international incident in a jurisdiction where neither of you has operational cover, and the documentation you just took becomes the least of your problems, because the Atlanta PD and 3 federal agencies will be in this building before your cars reach the highway." She said it like she knew it for a fact. She didn't know it for a fact. The man was quiet. She said, "The address in Seoul, Domdong. Let her go. Take the drive and go. End this tonight without—" The phone on the bed buzzed. All 3 of them looked at it. The screen was face up, and the notification was visible. A message. From a number with a Seoul area code. 4 words, the same as before but different. "Jisoo is out. Move." Zuri looked at the screen. The man looked at the screen. And then the door behind her, the main door, the one to the hallway, came open. Not loudly, not with force, with the specific quiet of someone who had been waiting on the other side of it for exactly the right moment, listening through it for the moment when the room's attention was divided, and Seo Juntae came through it with the quiet one a step behind him, and the 2 of them moved into the room with the economy of people who had done this before, and the man with the weapon turned, and Juntae said, in a voice that had no heat in it anywhere, "It's over." The man looked at him, looked at Zuri, looked at Derek, who had pressed himself against the far wall with the expression of someone who had fully processed the magnitude of his miscalculation, looked back at Juntae. "The drive," the man said. "Is already gone," Juntae said. "My contact in Seoul moved it 40 minutes ago. What your people took was a copy, constructed for exactly this scenario." He paused. "Jisoo is out. The facility in Domdong is compromised. Your network's Seoul operation is being documented in real time." His eyes did not move from the man's face. "You have one exit from this room, and it runs through me." The air in the room had the specific density of a moment before a structural decision, the half-second before a building either holds or doesn't, when everything is still suspended and the physics haven't finished their verdict. Zuri stood in the center of it, not behind anyone, not protected by anyone, just standing in the room she'd walked into on her own terms. And she felt her heartbeat in her throat, and her hands were entirely steady. And she looked at Seo Juntae across the charged space of the room, this man who had flown across the world for an umbrella and an hour of conversation, and his eyes moved to her for exactly 1 second. 1 second of something that was not operational, not tactical, something that lived in a different register entirely. And she held it, and the second lasted longer than a second. That was the thing about moments that split a life into before and afters. They expanded, they refused the normal compression of time, they held themselves open like a wound that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to close. Juntae's eyes were on her for that one extended second, and she read in them everything he didn't say. That he'd heard her. That she'd bought the moment he needed. That the 4 words on the phone screen, Jisoo is out, move, had been the signal he'd been waiting for since the message from Seoul, the confirmation that the secondary operation had succeeded, that the pieces he'd moved without telling her he was moving had landed where he'd needed them to land. She read all of it, and then the second ended and he looked back at the man with the weapon and the room snapped back into its physics. The man's name, she would learn later, was Shin Dae-won. 43 years old, former military intelligence, South Korean, who had moved into private sector work of the specific kind that didn't appear in any official record. He had worked for the rival network, the Busan Los Angeles operation, which carried the internal name Cheongpa, meaning a faction that had broken from something larger, for 11 years. He was their senior field operative in North America. None of this was available to her in the hotel room at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in April. What was available to her was the quality of his stillness when Jun-tae said, "It's over," the way a man looked when he was running calculations that weren't resolving, when the exits he'd entered a situation with had narrowed to something that no longer resembled an exit. He said, in Korean, something short. Jun-tae answered in Korean, equally short. The quiet one, whose name was Han, she would later learn, who had worked for Jun-tae for 9 years, and who was, under the surface stillness, one of the most precisely dangerous people in any room he occupied, had not moved from his position near the door. He didn't need to move. His position was the point. Shin Dae-won looked at the phone on the bed. He looked at Derek, who had not moved from the wall and whose face had the specific gray quality of a man who had spent 2 years believing he understood the nature of the thing he was involved in and had discovered, in the last 20 minutes, the full dimensions of his misunderstanding. He looked at Jun-tae. He lowered the weapon. Not a surrender. The distinction was important and everyone in the room understood it. A tactical withdrawal from a position that had become indefensible. He set the weapon on the desk beside him with a deliberateness that communicated that he was making a choice rather than being disarmed, which was its own kind of dignity, and he said in English, looking at Jun-tae, "This isn't finished." "It's finished tonight," Jun-tae said. "What happens next is a separate conversation." Shin Dae-won looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked, briefly, at Zuri. A single assessment, recalibrating something. And then he walked to the connecting door he'd come through and went back through it without another word, and the door clicked shut behind him. The room breathed. Derek made a sound that was not quite a word. Jun-tae looked at him with the particular attention of a man cataloging a debt. Derek said, "I didn't know they were going to take her. I need you to understand that." "Sit down, Derek," Zuri said. He sat down on the edge of the bed where she'd told him to, which told her something about the state he was in, that he was taking direction from her when he'd built his entire evening around being the one with information. She stood in the center of the room and looked at Jun-tae and said, "Jisoo, confirm safe." Confirmed. His voice had come down from the operational register. Something in it had changed. Not relaxed, that wasn't the right word, but decompressed, the way a structure decompressed when the load it had been bearing was redistributed. "My contact got her out 43 minutes ago. She's in a safe location." And the real drive has been in Seoul the entire time. The copy was constructed 3 weeks ago when I began to understand that the move might be compromised. He paused. "I should have told you." "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I didn't know how deep this conversation would go before I had to." "You should have told me," she said again. Not with heat, with the specific weight of a person establishing a baseline. "If we're going to be anything to each other, I need to know when you're running an operation that I'm standing in the middle of, even if you think the information is too dangerous for me to have. You tell me anyway, and we figure out the danger together." He held her gaze. He said, "Yes." She nodded once. She turned to Derek. Derek Okonkwo looked in the lamp-lit hotel room like a man at the bottom of something. Not broken. The essential structure of him was still there. She could see it. The basic competence and intelligence that had made him credible to the people who'd recruited him, that had made him someone Cheongpa found useful. But the scaffolding that had held the decision-making together, the story he'd told himself about what he was doing and why and what kind of person that made him, had come down in pieces over the last hour, and he was sitting in the debris of it. She sat across from him, not because she felt warmth toward him right now, but because she understood that what happened in the next 10 minutes would determine what happened to him, and she was not, underneath the anger she felt, and she did feel it, specific and cold, for the way he'd used their history as a tool. She was not someone who abandoned people at the bottom of things if there was another option. She said, "Tell me why." He looked at her hands, her face, then at the middle distance somewhere between them. "Money," he said. "To start. I was in a bad position financially. The consulting work wasn't. I'd made decisions that were hard to walk back. They offered a contract that looked legitimate on the surface, routing coordination for a European logistics firm. I didn't ask enough questions." He stopped. "And then I was in. And the questions I hadn't asked became the questions I couldn't ask, because asking them would have meant admitting what I'd walked into. And then they found out you were at the same university as the woman Seo Jun-tae was looking for." He nodded. "Once. And they offered you something to come tonight." He nodded again. "What?" A long pause. "Clearance. My file. Cleared. The evidence of what I'd done for them. Destroyed. A clean exit." He looked up. "I've been trying to get out for 14 months. Every time I thought I was close, they found another way to keep me in. Tonight was supposed to be the last thing." She sat with this. She said, "Is there anything you have on them? Documentation? Records? Anything that would give Jun-tae what he needs to close this down?" Derek looked past her at Jun-tae, who had not moved, who was standing near the door with the specific stillness that she now understood was not coldness, but discipline. The exercise of a will that had been trained over decades to hold itself in check when the instinct was something else. Derek opened the laptop on the desk. He typed for a moment. He turned the screen toward Jun-tae. "Routing records for the last 18 months, he said. "The actual records, not the sanitized versions. Transfer documentation for 16 operations. Financial trails for the Busan side and the LA side." He paused. "I kept copies. I know how that sounds. I kept them because I knew eventually I'd need something to trade." Jun-tae came forward and looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. He said to Han in Korean something that sounded like an instruction. Han moved to the desk and produced a device, small and unremarkable, and began the transfer. Jun-tae looked at Derek. He said, "This clears your involvement if it holds up." Derek exhaled. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound of a man releasing something he'd been carrying for too long, which is not the same thing as relief, which has a warmth to it. This was more like setting down a weight in the dark and not yet knowing whether your hands still worked. "I'm going to need you to stay available," Jun-tae said. "My legal team will need to walk through the documentation with you. There will be a process." "I know. And Derek," Jun-tae's voice was not unkind, but it was not warm. "If you come near her again without invitation, the process becomes a different kind of conversation." Derek looked at Zuri. She said nothing. He nodded. They left the hotel at 12:23 in the morning. The reunion had ended. The ballroom was being cleared by the catering staff, the string lights still glowing over empty tables, orchids wilting in their low vases. The votives guttered down to nothing. She knew this because the lobby elevator doors opened on the ballroom level briefly before they continued down, and she saw it through the elevator glass. The aftermath of a party, the specific desolation of a space that had been arranged for significance and was now being disassembled. She thought about the dress. $412. Still intact, which seemed improbable given the evening. She looked down at herself. The deep burgundy still holding its color, the hem clean, the shoes a catastrophe that she wouldn't fully assess until she was home and out of them. She looked at her reflection in the elevator glass and thought, "You walked in here to survive a reunion, and now it is the smallest thing that happened to you tonight." The lobby was quiet. A few late arrivals moving through. The front desk staff with the particular composed efficiency of people who had learned to read hotel lobbies the way Zuri read structural drawings, for the things that needed attention and the things that didn't. Outside, the Atlanta night had cooled slightly. The cars were at the curb. She stood on the marble steps and didn't immediately walk toward them, and after a moment Jun-tae came to stand beside her, not talking, just standing there in the way he'd done in Seoul, on a pharmacy step, in the rain, when she'd taken a piece of his awning and they'd existed for an hour without performance. She said, "Victoria." Her family's financial exposure to the Changpa network is real, he said. Whether she understood the full nature of what she was involved in, that's less clear. People sometimes carry the consequences of other people's decisions without fully understanding them until it's too late. Will she be? I have no interest in her, he said. She's not my concern, and she's not my target. What happens to her family's financial situation will play out through normal channels. He paused. She's not going to be harmed. Zuri exhaled, not because she was relieved for Victoria's sake exactly, more because she needed the story of Victoria Ashcroft to be something she could put down. She needed it to be finished, to not require more from her. Not her energy, not her attention, not the particular emotional labor of continuing to process the fact that a woman she'd spent years managing her response to had been, on some level, also managed from the outside, had been a piece in something larger and uglier than the ordinary cruelty she'd always attributed to personal malice. It was easier to hate someone clean. She said, the things she said about me, in the ballroom. Yes. Were they strategic? Was she told to say them? He was quiet for a moment. I think, he said, with the careful precision she'd come to recognize as his mode of honesty, that she said them because she believed them. And I think she was also in a place designed to wound you because someone understood that a wounded version of you was easier to use as a variable in the evening's events. He paused. Both things can be true. She knew they could. She'd always known they could. She believed them, Zuri said. That's the part that doesn't change, regardless of the operational context. Yes. I can't fix that by tonight being dramatic. No. She stood for a moment with the honest weight of it. The fact that no elegant resolution was available for the specific damage of being told by someone who meant it, that you were too much and not enough simultaneously, that you were built wrong for wanting what you wanted, that the life you'd constructed on your own terms was evidence of a deficiency rather than a choice. No counterargument disposed of that. No powerful man appearing at your side in a ballroom undid the years of carrying it. She knew that. She just needed a moment to sit with knowing it, in the spring air, outside the hotel where she'd walked in 2 hours ago with her armor on and her jaw set. She said, I'm going home. He said, yes. I need to sleep and I have a competition brief due in 48 hours and a site walkthrough on Friday, and about 17 things I have to think about very carefully. I know. About all of this, she said. About you specifically. I know, he said again. I'm not asking for anything tonight. I came to find you. I found you. The rest of it, he gestured slightly at the space that encompassed the entire evening, the restaurant, the hotel room, the photograph, the cars, Shindai Wan's lowered weapon. All of it was not the plan. She almost laughed. Not quite. Something adjacent to it. Something that started in her chest and didn't fully surface but changed the quality of her expression, and she felt him register it, felt the small, careful warmth of his response to it. She said, the umbrella, in Seoul, do you still have it? He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, something softer than surprise, something that lived in the neighborhood of being known. Yes, he said, I still have it. She nodded once, like this answered something. She walked down the marble steps. She stopped at the bottom and looked back up at him. She said, call me tomorrow. Not from a number I don't recognize this time. He said, I'll have Han put it in your contacts. She said, that's not... I'm joking, he said. She looked at him. He was not, technically, smiling, but the corners of his mouth had done something that, on a different face, would have been a smile, and it changed him in a way that made him look briefly like the man on the pharmacy step. The man before the gravity had resettled into its usual positions. The man who had said, I'll try to someone who asked if he was okay. She turned and walked to the first car, and the driver had the door open. And she got in, and she didn't look back because she was not, tonight, a woman who looked back. She got home at 1:16 in the morning. She stood in her kitchen in the dark for a while without turning on the lights. The city visible through the window above the sink, Atlanta doing what it always did. Living, moving, not waiting on anyone's timeline, indifferent to the specific reverberations of one person's Tuesday in the way cities were magnificently indifferent to everything except their own ongoing noise. She took off the shoes first. The relief was structural. She set them side by side under the kitchen table with the care of someone who still respected what they'd cost, even if they'd also failed her in an alley, and she stood on the cool tile in her feet and felt the ground under her and let the accumulated weight of the evening move through her the way weight needed to move through. Not suppressed, not managed, just acknowledged and felt. She thought about Victoria. She thought about the specific sentence. No man would want a woman like her. She held it the way you held a structural drawing that contained an error you were trying to locate. Not because you wanted to look at the error, but because you needed to see exactly where it was before you could account for it. She turned the sentence over. She identified, with the precision of someone who had been doing this work on herself for a long time, where it had caught in her. Not in the obvious place, not in the public humiliation of it, but in the older place, the place that predated Victoria, the place that the sentence had found and fit into like a key into a lock that had always been there. The fact that she'd built everything she had on her own had never felt like a wound until someone named it that way. She knew the difference between solitude and loneliness. She'd chosen solitude, constructed it deliberately, made it functional and even beautiful, the way you made a room functional and beautiful through considered design. She'd looked at the women around her who'd wanted the relationship, the marriage, the approval of being chosen, and she'd felt something that she'd called freedom, and that had also, occasionally, at 1 a.m. in her kitchen, felt like something else. It didn't mean Victoria was right. It meant she was human. She made tea because she needed something warm, and because the act of making it, the specific sequence of kettle and cup, and the small, careful decisions about temperature and timing, gave her hands something to do while her head worked. She sat at the kitchen table with the tea and her phone and the architectural competition brief open on her laptop, and she tried to do actual work, tried to get back inside the problem of a mixed-use development in Cascade Heights that required her to solve for pedestrian flow and green integration simultaneously. And she managed about 40 minutes of it, which was not nothing, before the work blurred and she sat back and accepted that she was not going to solve this particular problem at 1:58 in the morning. She thought about soul. She thought about the specific texture of that evening. The rain, the cold, the tired stranger on the step, the way he'd held the umbrella she'd given him like he was deciding whether he was worth the protection. She thought about how she'd gotten in the car and looked back once, through the rear window, at the man still standing there, and how she'd carried that image for months in the unexamined part of her mind, the part where things went when they didn't have a category yet. She thought about what he'd said at the restaurant. You treated me like a person when I had forgotten what that felt like. She thought about what it cost to build the kind of life that produced a sentence like that. What kind of years, what kind of decisions, what kind of accumulation of being looked at through the specific lens of what you controlled and what you were worth and what you could provide and what you could take. She thought about that, and she thought about the way he'd held her gaze in the hotel room when Shin Dae-won had the weapon, and she'd been standing in the center of the room, making an argument about jurisdiction and federal agencies with her heart rate doing something she couldn't name, and the 1 second of his eyes on her had carried everything that couldn't be said in a room with an armed man in it. She went to bed at 2:30. She did not sleep for a while, which she'd expected. She lay in the dark and let the evening play and replay in the edited way the mind played events back, not sequentially but selectively, hitting the moments with the most unresolved charge, the moments that still needed something from her. Eventually, the editing became slower, became less urgent, became the beginning of sleep. She slept. He called at 9:14 the next morning. She was on her second coffee and already 2 hours into the competition brief, which was going better than she'd expected, given everything. The problem having apparently loosened something in her overnight so that the pedestrian flow solution she'd been fighting came clear in the early morning light with a cleanness that felt like reward for the previous day's difficulty. She let it ring twice, looking at the number, unfamiliar, Seoul area code, and then answered it. You said not from a number you didn't recognize, he said. I gave Han the instruction. It went wrong somewhere. She almost smiled. Where are you? Still Atlanta, the Whitmore Grand. A pause. Different floor. How's Jisoo? Shaken. Physically unharmed. She's in Seoul. She's with people I trust. His voice had something in it that was not quite relief. Relief's more serious sibling, the version that knew how close the alternative had been and hadn't finished processing the distance between them. She wants to send you a message. She doesn't know me. She knows what you did in that hotel room, what you said to Shin to hold his attention. He paused. She says, Bulgul. It means, roughly, someone who doesn't bend. Zuri sat with that. She said, tell her I said thank you. She heard him write it down. The small domestic specificity of that. Him writing something down, a man with 4,000 employees and a criminal network and a briefcase's worth of complexity, writing down a message from one woman to another, grounded something. She said, "The documentation. Chiangpa's financial records, what happens with them?" My legal team begins the process today. The European regulatory authorities will receive the appropriate material through the appropriate channels. It will take months. It will be complicated, and some of it will be ugly. And there are people in my organization who are going to be exposed by what Derek provided. He was quiet for a moment, including some people I trusted. That's the part that's going to take the longest, she said. Not legally. Yes. She looked at the competition brief on her screen, the clean lines of the Cascade Heights elevation, the pedestrian walkways she'd finally solved, the green integration that made the building feel like it was growing from the neighborhood rather than imposed on it. She thought about structures that became invisible because they worked so well. What she'd said to a stranger in the rain, what he'd said back, "I think I've been building things the wrong way." She said, "How long are you in Atlanta?" A pause. "How long would you like me to be in Atlanta?" She looked at the screen. She looked at the window. She looked at the city in the morning light, Bradford pears white and extravagant along the street, spring insisting on itself the way spring always did, indifferent to anything that had happened the night before. She said, "I have a site walkthrough on Friday in Midtown. An hour, maybe 90 minutes. If you want to see what I actually do..." "Yes," he said. She blinked. "I hadn't finished the sentence." "I know," he said. "The answer is still yes." She sat with that. She said, "I'm going to need you to understand some things about how I operate, in general, not just professionally. Tell me. I don't rearrange myself for other people. I've done that before and it costs something I can't afford to keep paying. What I have, what I've built, my work, and my firm, and this city, and the life I've made here, those aren't things I'm willing to diminish because someone else's life is larger, or louder, or more complicated." She paused. "You can be in my life if you can be in my life. Not the version of my life that makes room for yours at its own expense. The actual version." A silence, long enough that she understood he was holding the words rather than rushing past them. He said, "In Seoul, when you asked if I was okay, you said it before you knew anything about me, before you knew whether it was worth your time, before you had any information about what kind of person you were sitting next to." "Yes, I want to learn how to do that," he said. "What you did on that step, the way you were in that restaurant, in that hotel room, the way you made decisions I was too close to the situation to make. I have been surrounded for so long by people who calculate everything, who approach every interaction with an inventory of what it's worth that I've forgotten." He stopped. "I'm not looking for someone to rearrange themselves. I'm looking for exactly the version you're describing, the actual one." She heard him breathing. She heard Seoul in the background somewhere. Traffic, a voice, the small ambient sound of a city going about its life. She said, "Friday, 10 in the morning, wear shoes you can walk a construction site in." He said, "I'll buy some." She said, "Not Italian leather, actual work boots." He said, "I don't own work boots." She said, "Then today's an adventure." She heard it then, the actual smile, the one she'd been watching form and retreat across his face all evening, present now in the quality of his voice, in the small particular shift of it. And she understood that she was hearing something he didn't give often, that it had weight because of its scarcity, and she held it in the same way she'd held the image of him standing in the Seoul rain with her umbrella, warm and inexplicable and worth keeping. She said, "Go take care of your people." He said, "I'll call tonight." She said, "From a number I recognize this time." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in the morning kitchen with the coffee cooling and the competition brief glowing on the screen and the city moving outside the window with its total indifference and its constant motion and its very long memory for everyone who had ever stood at its edge and decided to stay. She put her hands on the keyboard. She went back to work. 3 days later, on a Friday morning in April, a construction site in Midtown Atlanta received 2 visitors. One of them was Zuri Holloway, who walked the site the way she always walked sites, with a clipboard and a specific kind of attention that the foreman, a man named Curtis, who had worked with her for 4 years, described to his crew as surgical. She moved through the skeleton of the building with the fluency of someone who saw the finished version overlaid on the current state, who could stand in raw concrete and see the room it was going to become. The other was a man in work boots that were clearly new but were, she had to admit, the correct kind. He walked half a step behind her and asked questions. Not the questions of someone performing interest, but the questions of someone who was actually trying to understand, who had looked at the drawings she'd sent him and come with specific things he wanted to see in person. He asked about load distribution. He asked about the pedestrian integration, why she'd angled the walkways the way she had. He crouched down to look at a joint detail that she'd had 3 conversations with the structural engineer about and said, "That's the solution you fought for." She looked at him. He said, "I read the project notes you sent." She had sent him the project notes. She hadn't fully processed, until this moment, that she'd done that. Curtis, watching this exchange from 12 feet away with the expression of a man who had worked with Zuri Holloway for 4 years and had never once seen her send project notes to a personal guest, revised several assumptions he'd been operating on and kept his observations to himself, which was one of the things that made Curtis good at his job. They walked the full site. She showed him the corner where the green integration created a natural gathering space that the neighborhood association had initially resisted and then embraced once she'd rendered it properly. Showed them what it would feel like to sit there on an afternoon. She showed him the structural decision that had saved 2 weeks of construction time and cost her 3 nights of sleep, and an argument with the general contractor that she still considered one of her better arguments. She showed him the detail in the facade that most people would never consciously notice, but that would, on a subconscious level, make the building feel like it belonged in this specific neighborhood and not transplanted from somewhere else. He looked at all of it. He said, standing in what would become the lobby, concrete floor and rebar still visible, and the sky open above them where the roof hadn't yet closed. Invisible structures. She looked at him. "What you said in Seoul," he said. "The kind of building people don't notice holding them together until it's gone." She stood in the roofless lobby and felt the April sky above her and the concrete under her feet, and the very specific sensation of a person who had said a true thing about themselves to a stranger in the rain and had the stranger hold it for 8 months and give it back to her in a building she'd made. She said, "Yeah." He looked at the space around them. "You're good at this." "I know," she said, not arrogance. Fact. She'd earned the right to say it plainly, without apology, without the performance of modesty that people expected from women who were good at things. She'd built the knowledge of her own competence the way she built everything, from the ground up, load-bearing, tested under real conditions. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'm not easy," she said.